The story begins with our main man, Joseph Goldberg, or as everybody calls him, Joe. You see, Joe here is obsessed with having somebody to love and also having somebody love him in return. And he goes to the extreme, murder, to make sure he gets that. He's like this because when he was a kid, his father would abuse him and his mother, so he puts an end to it by killing his father in order to protect his mother, but that gets him permanently separated from his mother, who was the only person who actually loved him. He then gets sent to this guy by the name of Mr. Mooney, who would constantly lock him up in a glass cage in order to teach him a lesson. Anyways, a few years later, Joe starts dating this girl by the name of Candace. After a while, Candace cheats on Joe, and when Joe finds out, he goes and kills her secret lover. Candace then tries to break up with Joe, but Joe didn't take that too well, so he tried to kill her, and thinking she was dead, he buries her and leaves. Candace, who has no proof of Joe trying to put her to sleep, is then forced to go into hiding. Anyways, 2 years later, Joe finds a new girl that he's interested in by the name of Guinevere Beck, but everybody just calls her Beck. He's trying to become a writer and has one of the worst group of friends I've ever seen. Joe then stalks Beck, and for some reason, when he does it, I'm okay with it.
He's right. Do you know that?
Anyways, while doing his research, he finds out that Beck has this boyfriend by the name of Benji, who's clearly not good enough for Beck, so he puts him on a shirt and starts dating Beck. But dating Beck means dating her friends, and more specifically, her best friend named Peach, who's actually in love with Beck. Joe then quickly puts her on a shirt because she's trouble and she found out that he killed Benji, and she was trying to steal Beck away from him. After Peach dies, Beck starts going to therapy, and probably got a 2-for-1 deal with a therapist because she cheats on Joe with that therapist. So at this point, anything that happens to Beck, she deserves.
I couldn't agree with him more.
Anyways, even though she cheated on Joe, Joe was willing to overlook the fact that she cheated on him. But she wasn't willing to overlook the fact that he killed Benji and Peach. So after Joe tried to reason with her while he locked her up, and she refused, he quickly put her on her shirt. Well, actually a book, because he wrote a book in her perspective claiming that Dr. Nikki, her therapist, is the one who actually killed her. And that somehow worked because everybody assumed that Dr. Nikki is the real killer and he gets arrested. But before Joe can celebrate, the season ends with Candace showing up to talk to him. And like how I assume Joe stays safe on the internet, for less of the price of 6 tubes of Carmex, which is surprisingly cheap, through NordVPN you could also stay safe on the internet, and my favorite part is that you can also get access to more TV shows and movies that otherwise wouldn't be available in your area. If you want to check it out, link is in the description. Alright, back to the show. Season 2 starts with Joe, who runs away from Candace all the way to Las Vegas, where he changes his name to Will in order to hide from Candace, who wants to ruin his life and get him arrested. Anyways, while in Las Vegas, Joe falls for this new girl by the name of Love, who has this twin brother by the name of 40. 40 is basically this big baby that Love has to constantly take care of. Anyways, Joe and Love start dating, but they can't seem to hang out enough because 40 is always coming into the mix. And while Joe tries to figure out how to deal with 40, he gets close with his landlord Delilah and her little sister Ellie. And while talking to Delilah, he finds out that she was sexually assaulted by this walking trash can by the name of Henderson, who is too famous to just put down. So Joe accidentally puts him on a shirt while trying to get him to confess. Candace then finds Joe, thanks to 40, and starts dating 40 in order to get closer to Joe. She then reveals to Love that her and Joe dated and that his real name is Joe Goldberg, instead of the fake one, Will. She also placed into 40's head that Joe is actually a serial killer, which she's not wrong and is a victim, but at this point I just want her to be put on a shirt. Anyways, Delilah starts suspecting Joe for the murder of Henderson, which leads her to finding out that Joe has a glass cage where he most likely locks people in. But before she can report that to the police, Joe finds her and locks her up, and decides that he's gonna be a good person and release her, but only after he says goodbye and has an escape plan. After everything was set in motion, he comes by to release Delilah, but finds out that she was murdered, and as it turns out, Candace finds Joe with the body and locks him up in the cage with the body. Instead of calling the police, she then calls Love to come see what Joe has done. When Love gets there, she quickly puts Candace on a shirt, finally, and revealed that she's the one who actually killed Delilah, and she did it to protect Joe, and also that she's pregnant. Joe then decides that he's gonna stay with Love, and tells Ellie that he's the one who killed Henderson, and also to leave town because she was gonna get put into foster care, and also agreed to send her money every month. 40 then finds out that Joe actually is a serial killer, and instead of calling the cops, again, tries to murder Joe himself, and ironically, he gets shot and killed by the cops. The murder of Delilah and Henderson is then blamed on 40. A few months later, we see Joe and Love moving into a new house, and the season ends with Joe possibly falling for his neighbor.
The third season picks off right at the end of the second season, where Joe and Love have moved in together, in the very fancy suburbs of Madre Linda. And of course, Joe being Joe, he already started preying on his neighbor, Natalie Engler, whose husband Matthew is a multi-millionaire who's rarely ever home.
What are the odds of that?
Natalie then takes it upon herself to seduce Joe, but Joe actually stops himself from doing anything with Natalie for 2 reasons. The first is that he realized that he needs to be there for his son Henry, and yeah, unfortunately for Joe, he had a son. The only reason why he didn't want a son is because he was afraid his son would turn out the way he did. Anyways, the second reason is that Joe realizes that he's married to the impulsive Love Quinn, meaning that if Love ever finds out about Natalie, Natalie becomes a hashtag. And unfortunately for Natalie, Love found out. Love then uses Natalie's help to open up a bakery and immediately unalives Natalie. This sets into motion a series of unfortunate events. You see, Joe helps cover up Natalie's murder by making it look like she left Matthew, which is completely plausible because not only is Matthew never around, but Natalie constantly cheats on him. But for some reason, Matthew did not want to hear any of that. Instead, he sets out on a mission to find out what happened to Natalie. And while that's happening, Henry gets sick with the measles, that he got because one of their neighbors, Gil, doesn't believe in vaccines. And unfortunately for Gil, Love found out and put him in a box under her bakery. A fresh tart. Get it? Because it's like a fresh start, but like tart because it's baking. Yeah, okay. Anyways, after being held in that box for a few days, Gil unfortunately unalives himself when he finds out that his wife has been bribing people and his son has been forcing people to wrestle naked with him. Gil's misadventure turns out to be a very good thing for Joe and Love, because they just made it look like Gil murdered Natalie and then logged out of life afterwards. But for some reason, Matthew did not want to believe any of that. So he hacks all the cameras in Madre Linda so he can find out what really happened to Natalie. And while he's doing that, his son Theo has been visiting, and he immediately falls in love with Love. Love also falls for Theo, who's been giving her all the attention that she wanted from Joe. But Joe couldn't care less because he's now in love with his boss Marianne from the library. And with Love being distracted with Theo, he gets to be distracted with Marianne. Unfortunately, their marriage has been falling apart, so Love suggests that they open their marriage. This is all thanks to Love's new best friend and probably the most annoying person in this season, Sherry. Since Sherry and her husband Carrie have had an open marriage, Love thought it was a good idea. And the first step to having this open marriage is for Love and Joe to have a 2-on-2 tag team wrestling session with Sherry and Carrie.
And then everything fell apart.
Exactly, because when Sherry and Joe were going at it, Love realizes that there's another woman that Joe is obsessing over. She then blurts out that she's never good enough for Joe even after killing Natalie for him.
You shouldn't have said that.
Unfortunately, both Sherry and Carrie heard the confession, so both Joe and Love put them both in the cage under the bakery. Joe basically goes,
I have to kill her in less than a week.
And tells Marianne that he's leaving Love so the two of them can be together. But Marianne's ex, Ryan, is constantly making Marianne look like a bad mother, and is constantly trying to take Marianne's daughter away from her. And that means Joe's gonna take it upon himself to put Ryan to sleep, which is exactly what he does. That being Joe's first kill of the season upsets Love, because Joe saw it to be no problem killing for Marianne, but is constantly mad at Love when Love kills for him.
Well, she has a point.
Theo then finds out that Joe has something to do with Natalie's disappearance, but thinking with the wrong head and believing that Love is a victim in all of this, goes and tells Love exactly what he knows. Love then whacks him in the head believing that he's dead. He then has Joe dispose of the body, but before he can do so, he realizes that Theo is alive and takes him to the hospital, which finally brings us to the most nerve-wracking dinner of the series. See, at this point, Joe knows that Love killed her previous husband, and Love knows that Joe wants to kill her. So Love paralyzes Joe by putting the drug on the handle of the knife.
None of this would be happening if you hadn't grabbed a weapon.
I'm afraid she has a point.
She then ties him up and calls Marianne over, and reveals to Marianne that Joe is a bad person and she should get away from him if possible. Marianne then packs her things and leaves never to be seen again, at least in season 3. Joe somehow predicted that he was going to be paralyzed beforehand and shot himself with adrenaline before being paralyzed. He then quickly and painfully kills Love, and burns the house down, making it look like both him and Love died. He even wrote a suicide note in the perspective of Love, tying up all the loose ends. Joe then gives Henry away to a coworker of his by the name of Dante, who has been trying to adopt a kid but couldn't. The season then ends with Joe moving away to France in search of Marianne.
You know, because this season is really just Joe having a mental breakdown, I'm going to put this in an order that makes sense. That being said, Joe catches up to Marianne and kidnaps her. But to Joe, now known as Jonathan Moore, who's a professor, he lets her go. And as Jonathan Moore, he meets a group of rich people that he starts to kill off one by one while masquerading as their friend.
Geez, why don't you just hit me with that right from the start?
Well, there's actually two people in the group that he actually likes. The first one is a guy by the name of Reese Montrose. You see, Reese here is an actual person who doesn't know Joe. But Joe here hallucinates a version of Reese who's responsible for the murders and is actually framing Joe for it.
Yeah, but he's not real.
Exactly, so all of Reese's murders are actually just Joe's murders, and it's just Joe manipulating himself into believing that it's Reese, till he finally logs the real Reese out of life. When Joe finds out that he's been having a mental breakdown this whole season. But that's about 4 bodies later. 5 if we're counting Reese. Anyways, the second person that Joe actually likes is his love interest for the season, Kate. And surprisingly enough, the two actually hit it off, amidst all the murders. Anyways, Kate really hates her father, Tom Lockwood, who got really rich in ways that Kate does not approve of. So she tells Joe about her father's shady dealings. So Joe takes this as an opportunity to add 2 more bodies onto his growing international list. One of them being Tom Lockwood and the other being the bodyguard he frames for that murder.
He's good at this.
Unfortunately for Joe, as good as he is, two things don't go his way. The first is that one of his students, Nadia, catches on to him and helps Marianne escape by faking her death. The second is that after taking out Tom Lockwood, Joe really wanted to be done with his murderous ways, so he tries to log himself out of life. But he survives. That's when he confesses to Kate that he's a murderer and that he's not a good person. But Kate, knowing all this, chose to stay with Joe.
What about the people he murdered?
What murder?
Nadia and her boyfriend Eddie then tried to get evidence against Joe, but that was their last mistake, because Joe kills Eddie and frames Nadia for his murder. The season then ends with Joe and Kate moving back to New York, and Joe not going back to being called Joe Goldberg. Yeah, I hope I answered all of your questions, but if I didn't, be sure to leave a comment. I read them all. And if you liked that video, leave a like and subscribe. I really appreciate it.